Yes. Yeah, we were asked to talk about this ministering amidst the diaspora. And so I'll go first. I'm Brad Eubanks. I serve as the Episcopal and Lutheran campus minister and chaplain at Northern Arizona University. And I've been a campus minister for about 10 years. For 10 years, I've done about the same thing each year. You know what I mean? Every year brought different flavors, different experiences, different people. But similar to academia in general, rather than taking the same group of people on a multitude of different experiences through the years, I find that my role is more to take continuously changing groups of students on similar experiences year after year. It's not to say that ministry now isn't different from ministry in 2010, or that college students now are not different than they were then. But for the most part, our job in traditional college ministry settings is to take people who just graduated high school, just left having to ask the teacher to use the restroom, and walk beside them in around 4 years to become what the world expects them to become. You know, fully functioning adults who can finance and lead their lives. Well, then COVID hit. And campus ministry during a pandemic is just different. If nothing else, for the first time in these 10 years, I feel like I'm very much doing something very different. Because all of a sudden, on March 13th, we went from being an in-person community at a traditional style 4-year university in one of the most stereotypical college towns in America to having a dispersed community of students across the United States. And yet our community has continued. I went from having everyone I interact with as being local here in Flagstaff to having students in every time zone in the United States, with one moving all the way to Germany in a few weeks. It really is like each campus community now has a diaspora spread across the world. And we could talk about how we now all gather online for worship, or how all of our D&D sessions must now meet on Zoom. But that's not what I see my primary call in this ministry is. Like many of you, I have a job title as chaplain. I am a chaplain embedded in a campus community. And at least how I understand it, one of my primary calls in chaplaincy is pastoral care. How am I supposed to provide pastoral care to students hundreds or thousands of miles away? I, perhaps like you, have students who have had to go back into living in unhealthy situations. Perhaps they came out in college and lived an out life, but never have come out to their parents. So they are having to stuff their entire identity back into the closet. Or maybe they simply have a toxic childhood home life that they thought they had finally escaped, only to find themselves living in it once again with really no end in sight. And then you have those other students who perhaps have okay home lives that they've been able to return to, but now find themselves nowhere near where they thought they would be at 19 years old. So how are we supposed to support them? You know, I don't know the answer, but what I do know is what I find myself doing. I find myself texting a whole lot more. Of course I do. I have students whose parents don't know they are no longer Baptist. They can't exactly set up a Zoom meeting they might be caught in with me or with our community right now. That said, I do find myself on Zoom a whole lot with students, one-on-one and in small groups, talking about all sorts of things, sometimes about nothing. For many of them, those in campus ministry are the only people they are interacting with consistently right now. They crave this human interaction. For many of them, what we would normally be doing here is going to get tea. So sometimes I even change my background to the local tea shop to help make that maybe a little better. And I would say that snow in June in Flagstaff would be unusual, but it really wouldn't. I also find myself mailing care packages. I find myself praying. You know, last year, our theme for this conference was uncharted. Well, I know that this year we are in an oasis, but honestly, right now, I feel quite uncharted right now. But what I do know is that we are called to continue to love our flock. A wise mentor of mine who is on this call right now used to always tell me that the one thing that was most important was that we are asked to love our flock. And that when we do that, the other details begin to fall into place. And well, I love my flock.
Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon, everybody from Boston, Massachusetts, where a thunderstorm is forming as I speak. I'm Isaac, and one of the many hats I wear is a parish priest with pastoral responsibility for young adults. The Boston area attracts tens of thousands of young adults each year, and a small percentage of them, students and non-students alike, find their way into parishes like St. Paul's in Brookline, where I serve. In the before time, if you were to ask me, a new priest, what my biggest challenge was ministering to my peers, I would have told you it was something mundane. They're all just so busy. Trying to find a time when we could get a critical mass together, even for something simple like a potluck, felt almost impossible. I miss those times. I really miss them. In the opening days of the pandemic, the 20 and 30-somethings I reached out to were just as shell-shocked as I was. As I'm sure was the case for some of you, my pastoral care was that of deep listening, truly a ministry of simple presence and empathy, if only because I just couldn't do anything more. I too was stretched emotionally and spiritually. The systems and institutions, the procedures and resources, the entire ecology of support that I relied on were just as upended as me and the person on my Zoom screen or my messaging app. What resource could I give the college freshman who moved back home to Oregon, but is worried sick about her queer friends who don't have a safe place to shelter? How could I help the newlywed who approached her life with the same discipline she brought to her brief career as an engineer, but ended up losing her job 2 weeks into a shutdown? And what do I tell the social worker who contracted COVID from her home visits and blames herself despite taking every precaution? What do I tell them? Except that this sucks. It really sucks. And yet, in the midst of all the suckage, God was still there. God is still here. I think one small silver lining for me was that this pandemic hit while we were still in Lent. Our peak here in Massachusetts coincided almost perfectly with Holy Week. So it was actually useful during those first few weeks to draw on the reality of the cross, of Christ's own suffering, to illustrate the point that God never leaves us. God's love never abandons us, even when our lives are just one tangled ball of suck. Now, we are several months into this strange new world, and so much is still very uncertain. What I feel 99% sure of is that the old normal, it's not coming back. And that's scary. And those who are fearful still need that ministry of presence so that they are not alone in their fear. But since we can't return to the way things were, the necessary corollary is a question I have increasingly encountered from my young adults in recent weeks. What comes next? what comes next for the world, what comes next for the communities I'm part of, big and small, and perhaps most immediately on their minds, what comes next for me? These questions, I would say, are acute moments requiring personal discernment. And in addition to pastoral care, I think discernment is a real gift that the church, all of us here at this conference, and all that we represent can offer young adults during this time of immense societal and individual disruption. If discernment is a prayerful posture of casting a vision, of seeking God's will, of listening to the still small voice inside each of us, then I think we are well equipped to help young adults do that. And so now when the woman who was laid off from her job at a children's hospital and can't carry out her Sunday Eucharistic visits to the women's jail, when she comes to me and asks, what do I do next? Well, I hope I still respond with an empathetic, this really sucks. But I'm also starting to get a glimpse that within that pastoral emergency is the seed of a meaningful period of discernment in her life. And that gives me hope, because it is one more way that the Holy Spirit never leaves us.